story of how my dog, Shadow, went missing and the horrors I found trying to bring him back. It started on a quiet Friday evening. I live alone in a small house just outside town, near the edge of a forest. It's a peaceful spot, perfect for someone like me who prefers solitude over the chaos of city life. Shadow, my German Shepherd, was my only real companion. I'd had him since he was a puppy, and we were inseparable. He was the kind of dog who seemed more like a person than a pet, always watching, always understanding. That night, I was finishing up some work on my laptop when I realized Shadow wasn't lying at my feet like he usually did. At first, I didn't think much of it. He probably wandered into the backyard to chase squirrels or patrol the fence. "Shadow!" I called out, my voice carrying through the house. No response. I got up, checked the kitchen, the living room, even the bathroom. Nothing. By then, I was starting to feel a little uneasy. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The backyard was quiet, too quiet. Normally, I'd hear the rustling of leaves or the chirp of crickets, but that night, it was dead silent. "Shadow!" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I started walking along the fence line, shining my flashlight into the woods that bordered my yard. The trees looked like looming figures, their branches twisting into shapes that made my skin crawl. That's when I noticed the gap. One of the fence panels near the back corner was loose, leaving just enough space for a determined dog to squeeze through. "Damn it, Shadow," I muttered under my breath. I grabbed a coat, slipped on my boots, and headed into the woods. The forest at night is a completely different world. The air feels heavier, the darkness thicker, and every sound seems amplified. My flashlight beam danced across the trees as I trudged through the underbrush, calling Shadow's name. At first, I was just annoyed. Shadow had never run off like this before. I figured he was chasing a deer or something, and I'd find him sniffing around a bush, tail wagging like nothing was wrong. But as I walked deeper into the woods, that annoyance turned into worry. The further I went, the stranger everything felt. The trees were wrong. Their trunks were gnarled and twisted in ways I didn't remember. The air smelled sour, like rotting leaves mixed with something metallic. And then there was the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through the branches. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. I was about to turn back when I saw it, a footprint. It was pressed into the soft earth near a cluster of ferns, but it wasn't Shadow's paw print. It was human, and it was fresh. My first thought was relief. Maybe someone else was out here and had seen Shadow, but that relief quickly turned to dread when I noticed something odd about the footprint. It was deep, like whoever made it had been standing there for a long time, watching. A chill ran down my spine. I shined my flashlight around, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. Or maybe I wasn't. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I wasn't even sure it was real. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. I froze, straining to make out the words, but they weren't in any language I recognized. It was more like a murmur, low and rhythmic, like a chant. "Shadow?" I called out, my voice trembling now. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was silence again. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a bark, but it wasn't Shadow's bark. It was distorted, echoing, like it was coming from underwater. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe Shadow, hurt but alive. Maybe some hunter who'd seen him. But what I found, I still can't explain it. The trees opened up into a small clearing, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. In the center of the clearing was a structure, an old, crumbling stone altar covered in moss and strange carvings. And around the altar, there were figures, at least a dozen of them, dressed in tattered cloaks that seemed to blend into the shadows. Their faces were obscured, but I could feel their eyes on me, even from a distance. I should have run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. But then I saw him, Shadow. He was lying near the altar, his body limp, his fur matted with something dark. "Shadow!" I shouted, my voice breaking. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, silent and still, like statues. I took a step forward, and that's when one of them turned to face me fully. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, a gaping blackness that seemed to suck in the light around it. The whispers started again, louder this time, like they were coming from inside my own head. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, but I couldn't take my eyes off Shadow, and then he moved. At first it was just a twitch, a flick of his tail, a shudder of his legs. But then Shadow lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes, they weren't his eyes. They were glowing, an unnatural, sickly yellow that seemed to pierce right through me. He got to his feet, slowly, almost mechanically, and took a step toward me. "Shadow," I whispered, my voice barely audible. That's when the figures started to move. They didn't walk, they glided, closing the distance between us with inhuman speed. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the light in the clearing seemed to pulse, casting everything in sharp, jagged shadows. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I sprinted through the woods, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Behind me, I could hear them. Footsteps that weren't quite footsteps, like the sound of dead leaves being dragged across the ground. And then there was the barking. It was Shadow's bark, but wrong, distorted, echoing, chasing me through the darkness. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the woods and into my backyard. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Shadow never came back. For weeks, I searched the woods during the day, but I never found any trace of him or the clearing. It was like it had never existed. But at night, I started hearing things. Scratching at the windows, low growls coming from the backyard. And sometimes, just before I fell asleep, I'd hear that same distorted bark. I don't go into the woods anymore. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them. The figures, the altar, and Shadow's glowing yellow eyes staring at me from the darkness.